In this lesson, we're going to take a look at freedom of the press in some detail, and really, the first concept we're going to discuss is that of defamation. And I'm going to define it first, but then we're going to talk about why we have it here with freedom of the press, but where else it could go in our discussions. But first of all, defamation in general is a false expression about a person that damages that person's reputation. And really, it originally was something that we associate with the media, with the press, and that's why we discuss it with freedom of the press, because for a long time in our history, really the only people who had access to enough ears in order to defame someone was the press, whether it be through a newspaper or eventually the radio. But really now you look at the different forms of media in which a person could be defamed, that could host this false expression about a person that damages their reputation. It's become so much easier, not only with television, the radio, but the internet and cell phones, text messages, Instagram, Facebook, blogs, online journals. There's so many different forms of media that really defamation isn't something just that the media has to worry about, but also everyday normal individuals. And we're going to take a look and kind of summarize the case New York Times versus Sullivan, a case that you looked at already. But really, this kind of applies to everybody now, not just the media. A couple things before we move on. The written form of defamation, you'll sometimes hear this term, is libel. If you hear something's libelous, that is a written form of defamation. So something a newspaper or a magazine or possibly someone posting something on the internet can be guilty of. The spoken form is called slander. And so that's the spoken form. If someone's making a speech or if someone's interviewed on TV, let's say, or on the radio, they could be guilty of defamation. Now, like I said, it's included in our freedom of the press discussion, but it's not limited to the media. It can be a difficult situation for students your age. For example, there was a case in Missouri in which a senior class trip was an annual trip to the St. Louis Cardinals baseball game. And the St. Louis Cardinals ran a promotion in which you could text a message and it would be posted on the scoreboard during the game. And while that senior class was there, someone from the senior class texted that a specific girl in their class had a sexually transmitted disease. Whoever was supposed to monitor these texts before they went up on the scoreboard, missed it, and it was posted for thousands of people to see. It turned out that this was false, and it hurt this girl's reputation. The idea that she possibly did have an STD. She couldn't finish the school year, and this girl's family sued not only the student who texted the message, but also the St. Louis Cardinals with she sued them for defamation. And so, this is the idea. Now, in the New York Times versus Sullivan, we kind of added a requirement. So far, for the normal person to sue for defamation, whatever was said about them has to be false, and it has to damage that person's reputation. In the New York Times versus Sullivan, it was an advertisement, not a story run by the New York Times, but an advertisement run by the New York Times, which was paid for by some civil rights leaders. And the first question is, what was in the ad? And basically, to summarize it, it was Southern politicians were targeting Martin Luther King Jr. with false charges in order to hurt the civil rights movement. And that was the gist of the ad. And it listed some people by name. But Sullivan was a city commissioner. And he claimed that this advertisement defamed him, that it was libelous, and that there were factual errors. And I'm not going to go into the details. You read about it. You heard about it in the video clip. But basically the issue became not was Sullivan defamed, not was it false, and did it harm his reputation. But the question the U.S. Supreme Court had to weigh was, should a public figure be able to sue for defamation this easily? So the question became, are public figures as protected from defamation as private citizens? with the idea being that if a government official, whether it be the president or the mayor of a small town, if they can sue for defamation with the same requirements as just the normal American, does that hinder freedom of the press? And the U.S. Supreme Court said no. Public figures aren't as protected. And basically they added an additional requirement. For a public figure to successfully sue for defamation, they have to prove actual malice, which means that they not only have to prove that something was false and that it harmed their reputation, but also that the speaker, quote unquote, in whatever form it comes, knew the information was false and still expressed it anyways. And so this is a very important principle in terms of freedom of press, because now it freed up the media to kind of chase stories that otherwise might have scared them off. A good example of this is the Watergate scandal, in which Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein, writers for the Washington Post, kind of followed the whole scandal in which President Nixon's campaign staff, members of that staff, broke into the Democratic National Headquarters in Washington, D.C. before the 1972 election, trying to look for, it was basically political espionage. Well, the Nixon White House denied any involvement in it, but Woodward and Bernstein followed the story, and eventually it led to a congressional investigation, to then the impeachment of President Nixon and his resignation. Well, without this precedent being set, Woodward and Bernstein may not have been given as much latitude to chase that story. In fact, they did print one story in which there was a mistake made, where they misunderstood a source and printed some false information that prior to the Sullivan decision would have left them open for a defamation lawsuit. But because of this, because they didn't knowingly print a false story, they would not be liable. Okay, now the next question is, who exactly is a public figure? And New York Times versus Sullivan have focused on a politician, but through the years it's been expanded to musicians and athletes and actors and actresses and people who are famous for just being famous, like the Paris Hiltons of the world, Kim Kardashian and people like that. And so that kind of makes it a little bit more difficult for these people to sue for defamation. They have to prove that actual malice, and that frees up the press a little bit more. Now, some enemies of freedom of the press. First of all, censorship. The idea that the government prohibits any form of expression. And really, it is very difficult to find any government censorship in the United States, because they are very rarely able to legally censor the media or anybody else for that matter. But you do see some self-censorship. For example, the movie industry rates their own movies. TV networks will censor their own shows, not because the government makes them, but because they don't want to upset their sponsors. Record labels put stickers warning parents of explicit language, but that's as much just to, not upset the music buying public. Okay, and then within censorship, there's kind of a subset called prior restraint. And this is when expression is censored even before it can be expressed. And so, it's even more difficult to find examples. There aren't that many examples of expression that could face prior restraint. Mostly the written word, or maybe the broadcasting of a TV special or a movie. Maybe you could see prior restraint there. But we're going to take a couple looks at newspaper cases, one involving a school and one again involving the New York Times, in which censorship and prior restraint come into view. And so you're going to take a look first at a case, Hazelwood versus Kuhlmeyer, and there's a reading that's going to come up after you're done watching this video that'll give you an introduction to this case. And then we'll have another VODCAST to kind of take a look at some situations in which, can a school newspaper be censored, or does it have as much protection as a regular newspaper? So, basically, New York Times versus Sullivan, the key thing to understand is the additional requirement a public figure has to prove in order to sue for defamation, and then censorship and prior restraint, kind of one is on top of the other. The idea of the government prohibiting a form of expression, sometimes even before it can be expressed.